building commander decks is hard. I know that, right? Especially when you're starting out. It can be really difficult to like get a proper like idea of like what you're supposed to do, what card goes in what deck, and is this good or is this too pricey for me and stuff like that. Now, I've been playing Commander since like 2021. I started getting into Magic around that time as well, and I've built a lot of decks since then. So I know like my way around building Commander decks. It's currently 2026 as I'm recording this. So yeah, I've been building Commander decks for a while. I have a lot of different ones that I play, and I have built a lot more that I don't play. But overall, I'm just trying to tell you guys that I'm kind of good at it, and like you can trust me on this, right? I know how to build Commander decks. I'm good at this stuff. Like trust me. So without further ado, I wanted to go over like 5 tips that I've learned while building Commander decks that I think will be of help to you guys as well, and help you guys improve your Commander deck building skills. So, the first tip that I want to give in this video is that you're supposed to play towards a win con. And of course that makes sense, you want to win the game, right? You can't just sit there doing nothing. But your deck needs to have like a somewhat clear, coherent goal, like how do I win the game? And for most decks that's through combat damage. Some people play Voltron or do it through commander damage, whilst others like assemble combos and stuff like that. Now, I'm not much of a combo player and stuff like that, but that's a fine win con. If you want to do a combo deck, that's fine. Your cards in your deck need to reflect that. You need to like have cards that will tutor for your combo and stuff like that, right? I also feel that it's generally better to have like a focused game plan that like leads you down to your win con. I'll come with an example here, right? My Gadrak deck, which I covered in an earlier video, you guys can go watch that if you want to. Basically, the idea behind that deck is that you make a lot of treasures with your commander, Gadrak the Crown Scourge, by board wrapping the board, and then you have a lot of mana open, which allows you to play big creatures with flying, like big dragons and stuff like that, and then you can fire breathing, which is basically like pumping up your creatures so they hit for more combat damage, whilst your opponents have like basically just been wiped with their boss and you have a lot of mana open and you play big creatures and you just hit them in the face. That's the win con of that deck. It doesn't need to be more complicated than just hitting your opponents in the head with big creatures. But if you have like that combat plan, you might want to like ensure that you can actually get through, which is why of course the deck runs board wipes, but it also runs like flying, creature removal and stuff like that. So yeah, generally have like a focused win con and make sure that you can actually like accomplish that win con. It will make it a lot easier to build your deck and be like, okay, this card actually helps me towards my win con, whereas this card probably doesn't. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, is just like have a focused game plan. You need to know what your deck wants to do. And yeah, that's the first tip, so we'll get on to the next one. Now, the next tip that I want to give you guys is to keep your curve in mind. And what does this mean? Well, basically a lot of decks benefit a lot from, for example, having stuff you can do on turn 1 or turn 2. The most powerful thing you can often do is have turn 1 ramp. This is really easy to do in green. A good example of this would be stuff like Kibo Uktabi Prince, where you can play stuff like an Arbor Elf or an Arboreal Grazer to accelerate your game plan so you can play a commander on turn 2 instead of turn 3, which is really important because Kibo has an untap ability that you want to be using as often as possible, basically. So like, you can see how it's important to get this guy out 1 turn earlier. That's 3 additional artifacts that your opponents are going to make, which means that you're going to get a lot bigger monkeys, and then you can just play your monkeys a bit later on, like the next turn. Turn 3 you can play monkeys, because then you will be able to like get more mana from Kibo and stuff like that, right? This is just one example. You can also do this with like 4 mana commanders, where like it's really good to ramp on turn 2 instead, so you can get your commander out on turn 3. And stuff you could do this with like Mana Rocks, Arcane Signet, the Talismans, stuff like that, right? There are a lot of more like 2 mana ramp spells in Magic that are a lot cheaper than the 1 mana ramp spells, so that's a bit easier to do, especially because there are a lot more in different colors. In green you basically have, or if you have a 3 mana commander and you want to ramp into it on turn 2, you basically have to like either spend a lot of money or be in green, right? That's like your 2 options. Whereas a 4 mana commander, you can do this pretty much in every color, because you have like the signets, you have like the diamonds and the mind stones, stuff like that, right? There are a lot of good colorless options. So that's the second tip, making sure that you have stuff to play and like you can accelerate your game plan. Of course, you can't do this in every deck. If you're running like an Dragon deck, it doesn't make sense to run like 10 like 1 mana ramp spells. Of course, there will always be cards that are better. Just because one card is better doesn't mean you can have like effects that do the same things, just like slightly worse. Again, like if you look at the Kibo deck that I mentioned, I have Soul Ring in the deck, which is probably like the best card for turn 1, right? But I also just have stuff like, I don't know, like again like Arboreal Grazer, which like it's pretty mid card in Commander, right? So yeah, Of course, you also need to keep in mind that like these cards will be significantly weaker, like if you don't have them turn 1, so you want to have a lot of them, but you also want to like, you know, make sure that you're not drawing into them all that much later on, which is basically why it's also important to have a lot of card draw in these decks, and make sure that you can like actually do something with these mana dogs and stuff like that. For example, in the keyboard deck, I run draw like Collective Unconscious that draws cards for each creature I control. This works well because of course we have the mana dogs, but Kibo is also a commander that wants a lot of monkeys in play, so we need to play monkeys as well. So this deck runs a lot of monkeys. So like drawing cards based on that makes sense. For a 2-mana deck, that would be like drawing cards based on the amount of artifacts you have, or maybe having like a card draw commander or something like that. That gives you card advantage. But yeah, just keep that in mind. You also need to have a lot of like card draw or card filtering, because you don't want to draw into your Arboreal Grazer on turn 7 when you really need a board wipe, right? So yeah, keep that in mind, and we'll move on to the next tip. Now, the first tip that I want to mention is honestly pretty boring for some people, but I personally find it pretty enjoyable. And that tip is you need to look at your land base. Basic lands and pre-con lands aren't gonna cut it in most situations. Now, land bases are like pretty difficult unless you like actually know what you're doing, but there are like 3 different types of like lands, whereas one of them is like more of a subtype, I suppose. But the first type of land is utility lands. Now, utility lands are usually colorless, which means that they aren't good in your 5-color decks, but they are really good in your mono-colored deck. For example, my Gadrak deck, which is mono-red, runs a lot of utility lands, because that's just good to have. Now, utility lands usually come with a separate ability. For example, on the Dark Rift, you can like put a creature beneath the top X card of an opponent's library, where X is like a random number between 1 and 10 for 5 mana, and that's like honestly pretty damn good. For a utility land, right, it's pretty cheap as well. And there are a lot of like cheap utility lands either come with like card draw, removal, and like all stuff in between that. They also come with like life gain, pretty much anything you can think of. So like if you want a utility lands in your deck, I'd heavily advise that. And if you want to like look at where you can find a lot of utility lands, I'd advise you guys to go look on Scryfall and just type in type land, and then the colors that you want, like ID red white if you're in red white, right? So like anything like that, right? And just like look at the different utility lands that are available to you, and like they don't need to be good, they just need to do something, and preferably they need to enter untapped, because like having a land that enters tapped while also just tapping for colorless is like pretty damn weak. Then it needs to have like a really good and synergistic ability. The other type of land I want to mention is your filtering lands, like your mana fixing lands, right? And I did kind of spoil it when I said filtering lands, because the ones that I would recommend for this purpose is like the filtering lands, which like basically what they do is that they enter untapped, very, very important, very good to have, and they always enter untapped. The one downside is that you need to pay 1 mana of either a color or colorless basically to get more mana out of them, right? Now, these fix your mana really, really well. Again, the problem is that 1 mana, and why does this matter? Well, first of all, these lands do pretty much nothing on the first turn that they enter the battlefield, and second off, if you only need 1 mana, for example, like a cycling ability that costs 1, you won't be able to use this mana whatsoever, because you need 2 lands to like activate it, which in 99.9% of cases actually doesn't matter whatsoever, but it is a slight downside to these lands. But these lands are also really, really cheap, and they are really, really good. So I'd advise using these cards in your decks if you're on a budget. Other than that, you can just go on EDH Rec and look at like what kind of lands there are, but like have some amount of like mana fixing in your deck. I'd recommend the filtering lands because they're cheap and they're good. Other than that, we have like a card type that like is like kind of the in-between of like mana fixing and utility lands, and that is like these lands that enter the battlefield and then sacrifice themselves. This is like your Evolving Wilds and your Terramorphic Expand type card, but there are also like a cycle from New Capenna, which has like basically the same ability, you just gain a life in addition. And like these lands are really, really good for landfall decks, because they give you 2 landfall triggers. Of course, the land that you do end up getting enters tapped, which, you know, that's kind of bad. But other than that, 2 landfall triggers is better than 1 landfall trigger, so in most cases, these cards will genuinely be worth running. And they are also like pretty decent options if you're like in a 5-color deck or something like that. They're pretty decent options for mana fixing as well. So I'd include these cards in like decks that like really need them. So yeah, and of course this is on my budget. If you have like a crap ton of money, you can just like buy whatever EDH Rec tells you to. Just buy like the best lands that are in the format. Like it doesn't matter. You don't need my advice on that. Just run good lands in that case, right? But yeah, that was pretty much what I wanted to say for this tip. And yeah, on to the next one. Now then, my fourth tip will be like a bit of like cop out, I suppose, but genuinely like get input from your friends. Like I always like ask some of my friends if like they have input for the deck, and like if they own cards that would like go in the deck that I'm currently like net decking, right? This both save you money, which of course is nice, because like oftentimes it will be cheaper to like buy stuff off your friends than it will to buy stuff off the internet, right? And it'll also help you like have like a second perspective, like does this card actually help my game plan? And then you'll be like, maybe not. Like recently I was like building like Astral Slide deck, where like I ran Reliquary Tower and stuff like that. But honestly, I ended up cutting Reliquary Tower simply because it actually like interfered with my gameplay. Like of course I'm drawing a lot of cards, but I also want to be discarding cards in that deck, so it doesn't really make sense for me to have cards that prevent me from discarding if I go over hand size, because I don't really need all the many cards in the deck. Yeah, I ended up cutting my Reliquary Tower, which was also one of the more pricey lands that I had in the deck, so like that was cool as well. So yeah, that's my fourth tip. Look at cards objectively, ask your friends for help, just like send them the deck that's like, hey, can you see anything that like seems swag in here? And like, of course, they're free to flame you and whatever, like that's fine. But like, yeah, just get input from other people and see what they say. Honestly helps a lot. Now then, my final tip is actually the most important tip of this video, and it is the one that like save you the most money in the long run, right? And that is basically that a fun deck to build isn't necessarily a fun deck to play. And I've learned this the hard way. I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube about people learning this the hard way, and I've also had one of my friends learn this the hard way. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I'll tell you guys a story about like the deck that I learned this with. So basically, I was playing with some friends from my boarding school. We were like gonna like we like met up after a while, right? And this was after boarding school had ended, and then we met up, right? And they were all playing their new decks and stuff like that, and they were just like substantially better than my decks. And I was like, damn, this kind of sucks. I'm just getting shafted right now. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna build a more powerful deck. So I ended up building a Gyro deck, which you might already be able to see where this is going, which is basically like the Cheerio archetype. I didn't know that it was an archetype at the time. I thought that I was like goated as fuck that I figured out you could do this, and I was really excited about playing this deck, because like damn, I had so much fun building it. Like this is a really cool combo deck, not really combo deck, but like kind of like, right? What happened was that like I played it once, and it was basically just like me sitting there and playing solitaire by myself. The deck has very little interaction, and honestly isn't all that fun to play. Now, that deck luckily wasn't all that expensive, but still, it could have been a lot worse. For example, one of my friends built a Crack the Thumbless deck with Sakashima the Imposter. You guys might also be able to see where this is going. The deck wasn't fun whatsoever. It was fun to play like once, but it just felt like it was doing the same thing again and again, copying spells, returning them to hand, copying spells, returning them to hand, and like, it just wasn't fun to play or play against. Like, again, like, it was fun to build for him, probably, right? And it just isn't fun to play. Like, you can build these decks, yeah, but like, don't assemble them in real life. A deck is more fun with interaction and like where it has to interact with your opponents, because otherwise you might as well just like be sitting there and playing solitaire, right? And that rhymed, holy bars. But yeah, that's my final tip. I've also like built some decks like after that, which I was like, damn, this is pretty cool. I built like one with like the Weatherlight, and I don't remember what it's called, like the blue guy that tutors for artifacts, which is like you tutor for, you play like a 2-mana dog with an artifact, something like that, then you would like use your Arcane decks and find your like Weatherlight, and then just remove all cards in your deck except for like a Laboratory Maniac, and then you just win the game like that. It was like, yeah, it was pretty cool figuring out how to like do this like in theory, but would I want to play this deck? Not really, because it's just doing the exact same thing every time you play it, and it's also like kind of expensive, because you want all of the artifact lands, you want like Arcane Dexam, which is also like a bit more expensive, and like again, like it just isn't like. This is like a tip that you learn the hard way, and a lot of you people are probably going to like fall into this trap as well at some point, where like you have a deck that's like really fun to build, you'll figure out a lot of different stuff, but in reality it just plays like any other combo deck, or it's just the same thing again and again. Well, like, yeah, it's a cool idea, but it doesn't really translate all that well when you're playing it. So do be mindful of that when you're building a deck and you're like, damn, should I buy this? Just like ask yourself, like, how does this deck win again? Like, is this just going to be like the same thing again and again every time? Again, having a win con that's like like the same thing isn't necessarily bad. Like Voltron, even just like beating people with big dragons, it's not necessarily a big like a bad thing, because again, like that isn't necessarily like the same thing every single time. It's not like you're beating people over with the same dragons and like you're interacting with their boss state. You have to like think about, how do I get past this, I don't know, bird token that my opponent has, right? Whereas if you're just sitting there and playing a card game all by yourself where your opponents can't really interact with you other than just playing removal spells, it's not really all that interesting. So yeah, and just something I wanted to put out there as well, because I feel like that is like probably one of the most important tips that like save you guys some money. If you're like sitting there and like building a deck like a Cheerio deck with like Jora and stuff like that, which just wins by doing Laboratory Maniac. So yeah, again, like some Laboratory Maniac decks are fun, but the one that I mentioned most certainly wasn't. So yeah, do keep that in mind. And with all that said, I think those are like the 5 tips that I have for you guys. If you like the video, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a comment down in the comment section, and overall, yeah, have fun playing Magic, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!